Hello? Is this up? Hello? Hello, everybody. Hi, I'm Jody Schneider. I'm an editor at Bloomberg, and I am on the Board of Governors here at the FCC and a member of the professional committee that's helping bring you this lunch. Before it's my pleasure to introduce Steve Raymer, I wanted to let you know about a couple events, and one is tonight, and it involves Steve Raymer and his photos. Our wall committee is going to have a reception for his photos that are on the wall downstairs, so please join us after 6 p.m. tonight. We also have several talks coming up this week. Tomorrow we'll have Mark O'Neill and Kevin Lee, who are going to talk to us about Diwali, Moss, and Theravada Buddhists, the Hong Kong you might not know. On Thursday we have James Angus, who's going to talk to us about Lost in Translation, making the news in 42 languages. And this coming Tuesday, a week from today, we'll have the China-U.S. Trade War and Future Economic Relations by Lawrence Lau. So please sign up. I think there's still room in most of these events. And we'll see you at those. And please come tonight. It should be a really nice reception. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Steve Raymer, who's going to talk to us and show us photos and take our questions at the end. He's lived an extraordinary life as a photographer. He's traveled the globe to capture images of conflict, human migration and trafficking, endangered wildlife, and climate change. He's going to share some of the images from his new memoir called Somewhere West of Lonely, My Life in Pictures, along with stories behind the camera. Besides being a photojournalist, he's an authority in media ethics, and he'll discuss concerns about invasion of privacy and personal involvement in photography. He's an award-winning National Geographic photographer and author of several books, including one on Calcutta, the former British colonial capital of India, and Vietnam, where he also served as a U.S. Army officer in 1968 to 1969. He's a emeritus professor of journalism at Indiana University, where he's earned a reputation as an authority on the ethics of visual media. He's a graduate of the University of Wisconsin at Madison, a distinction I share, and at Stanford University. He's worked in more than 100 countries, and last year, Indiana University Press published his visual memoir, which is his 8th book. I give you Steve Raymer.
Jody, was there some papers here? Perfect. I found my talk, my professor's lecture notes. Thank you so much, Jody. A fellow Wisconsin Badger. And thank you very much for inviting me. And a special thanks today to my friend Robin Moyer, who's somewhere in the audience. Back during the Watergate days when President Nixon was being pummeled by Woodward and Bernstein, Robin and I were neighbors on Capitol Hill. And like most news hounds, we would wake up early in the morning to see what Woodward and Bernstein had in that morning's Washington Post. This is the second time I've had the honor of speaking to the club, an institution, as I've been told, and as I know personally, an institution that's known as a defender of free speech in a region that's not always comfortable with a vigorous press. I first became aware of the club, actually, when I was a young lieutenant in Vietnam. Hong Kong was the home base for a number of my early heroes, Kai's Beach from the Chicago Daily News, Stanley Carnell, Larry Barrows, etc., and this was their oasis. Later, reading John Le Carré's spy novel, The Honorable Schoolboy, I read that, quote, the striking view from the former club's 14th floor men's toilet was much celebrated. I can imagine Dave Greenway of the Washington Post and later the Boston Globe leading Le Carré around the old club, just as in real life he allowed John Le Carré to shadow him as a correspondent in Southeast Asia. Some years ago, one of your club members, Mark Pinkston, who's sitting over there in the orange turtleneck, Mark was the former chief government information officer, and he called me while I was staying at the Peninsula Hotel and said that I had to quickly jump in a taxi and get to the cargo area of Kai Tak Airport before a Lufthansa Boeing 747 jetliner lifted off from Hong Kong to its final destination in Tokyo. And Mark and I watched as British customs officers unpacked boxes marked mink that were bound for Japan. And this was a time when Japan was not a signatory to various global treaties to protect endangered wildlife and products from endangered animals. The boxes actually contain something far more precious to wildlife smugglers than mink. Some, pictures are the ultimate thing. Prove the point, I hope, if I can find oh, come on. See if I can get this to work. There we go. So the boxes contain, and this was a picture that we put together in a cargo shed, as I recalled, out at Kai Tak Airport. Those boxes marked mink contained 2,343 cheetah skins. When inspectors completed their work, Mark arranged for a small display for me to make a photograph of this booty. And we came to discover that this represented 10% of all the cheetahs in the world. Well, for today's program, I picked a few pictures from Asia, broadly defined, from my new memoir called Somewhere West of Lonely, My Life in Pictures. I'll go back to that. And, I have a little computer problem here, but that's okay. All right, there's the cover. We can leave it at that. My wife, Barbara, is fond of saying that knowing nothing about the subject has never stopped Steve from doing a book about it. And she's absolutely true. I had always wanted to do a book about Calcutta, so I went to Calcutta and started working on a book. And because I was intrigued with a place that I had heard so much about and never visited. Anyway, a friend and former colleague with a Pulitzer Prize and a PhD in the history of photography by the name of Claude Cookman wrote a very humbling review of my book in the Wall Street Journal. Claude described the premise of this book better than I could. He wrote that in 160 photographs, many never published, the book traces the path of a young newspaper photographer from Wisconsin, like Jody and I both are from that part of the heartland of the United States, who had never taken a color photograph when he was hired by National Geographic in 1972, through his first career photographing magazine stories and his second career as a faculty member at Indiana University. Now, and he was very kind to say that Steve Raymer's images remind us that however easy it is to click a cell phone shutter, apply an Instagram filter, or Photoshop in the background, a great gulf exists between our pictures and those of professionals who devote their lives to capturing the revealing moments that celebrate our shared humanity. And that's really the theme of my short talk today, is photographing our shared humanity, not so much to plug my book. If you want a copy, it's readily available on Amazon and takes 3 days to get here to Hong Kong. Like other photojournalists here in this room, there are really three great traditions in visual journalism. And just to be the professor for 5 minutes, I mean, our first tradition is what you would think. Our obligation is to take that unblinking look at life with all the successes and imperfections, and to get the picture for the sake of history, to be society's professional eyewitness. And not to belabor the point, but I usually talk to my students or to groups, and we look at the pictures of Margaret Bork-White from Life magazine. She accompanied U.S. troops as they liberated the Nazi concentration camp at Buchenwald. They're not exactly photographs that we would look at after lunch, a lovely lunch, but they are photographs that live on in the court of public opinion, that the Holocaust happened, that 7 million Jews and gypsies, Romanov gypsies, people the Nazis deemed undesirable, gays, lesbians, others, that 7 million people were murdered by the Nazis, and we have Margaret Bork-White's pictures to show that the Holocaust happened and it was a really big deal. Those giving that testimony in the court of public opinion for history. And certainly my children have seen those pictures, their children will see those pictures, etc. Well, beyond being a trustworthy and dependable eyewitness, the work of photojournalists certainly encompasses two other great traditions. One is to expose social evils. That's the second part of the job. If you're looking for an example, you could go no further than to the early 20th century photographer Louis Hine, who was a crusader against child labor, or as he called it, child slavery, in the United States. He photographed child labor between 1908 and 1912. And I'll see if I can get this to work. I need a mouse or something. Anyway, and Hine was a school teacher and a photographer from Wisconsin who believed that a picture could tell a powerful story. Hine believed that if people could see for themselves the abuses and the injustices of child labor, they would demand laws to end those injustices. And in fact, Hine photographed child labor not with the disciplined, objective eye that we would expect of a photojournalist, but with a conviction that he must expose the malevolence of this stain on the American conscience. Well, his work is largely responsible for the U.S. Congress passing the Keating-Owens Act of 1916 that was our first attempt in the United States to outlaw child labor. And then, since photography was invented either in France or England about 1830, photographers have documented our common humanity, that third great tradition, showing us everything from the family snapshots to images that we now consider priceless works of art. So this third tradition, I think if you're looking for an example, nothing could be more pertinent than the work of the French photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson. And for me, it's this third tradition, showing us our common humanity, our common connections, etc., that is so satisfying to try to show the universal aspects of life and the human experience: laughter and love, courage, despair, moments of reflection, or moments of spontaneity. The first day at school, the last goodbye at a funeral. As Edward Steichen, the curator of the Epic exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, said, the whole gamut of life from birth to death. And certainly many of my generation took this idea from Cartier-Bresson and others to heart. We may not have been able to have aspired to be war photographers or conflict photographers, but we could at least go out and try to patiently record what was happening in our own backyards. In fact, one of my early mentors said the best photojournalists educate and inform and often expose previously concealed layers of societies. And certainly throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, photojournalists have been involved in the great issues of our time, from the poor, the sick, the homeless, the hungry, the dispossessed, and of course, conflict. Now, without saying that we are so good, and I'm going to skip ahead here in my talk so we can talk a little bit about media ethics. For all of our high-mindedness, contemporary photojournalism certainly has some problems. And in fact, those of you who look at my exhibit downstairs may say, wait a minute, this guy, that color is pretty dramatic, and some of these pictures are really beautiful, but perhaps that gets in the way of us understanding the photograph, or maybe it's beautified or dressed up a little too much. For all of our high-mindedness, photojournalism has some real problems, both with the increasingly explicit nature of our images of suffering and degradation, and because of photojournalism's kind of inexact role in a world where scholars say we no longer have the same kind of moral and political framework that governs our responses to controversial and grisly images. In fact, the whole idea of the photographic truth of a picture is very much under attack in this era of fake news. Pictures can lie when a photographer sets up a picture in a situation to make it appear to be an honest photograph, and so forth, and they certainly can lie when the they are seamlessly manipulated in the computer. And the public knows just how easy it is for us to manipulate photographs. And frankly, we photojournalists are constantly using people as a means to an end. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant would have fits, talking to photojournalists, I think. We have to ask ourselves, can the ends ever justify the intrusive means of photojournalism? It's a worthy question. We have issues of the power relationships, the very unequal, for example. Anyway, we can talk about that in the questions. The larger issue, I think, is the nature of journalism. It's completely unlicensed. There's no great body of knowledge to be professed or practiced. There's no governing organization or norms with any teeth in them. And unlike other professions, journalists are focused, at least ideally, on being loyal to the truth and to the public and to a functioning democracy, not like a doctor or a dental hygienist who's focused on a client or a patient or a company. So, where do we go? Well, a professional journalist, by contrast, must hold himself or herself, I think, to the ideals that are morally permissible in ways that go beyond, and beyond is the key word here, in ways that go beyond what the law or the market or morality or public opinion would otherwise require. Being a journalist today, I tell students, is no longer defined by whom or for whom you work, but how you work. And that's the message that I'd like to leave with all of us today. Being that faithful witness is hard to define, but photojournalists are a special breed. Each one hears the click of the shutter in a slightly different way, but generally speaking, we have that commitment to the truth. We live on the razor's edge, and we construct that bridge to a better understanding of a complicated and interdependent world, at least ideally. So, why don't we look at a few pictures from my recent memoir, if I can get this thing to work. I don't know what's happened here, but let's see if I can get this to, I could use them. Okay, I can, let's see here, I'm just trying, there we go, perfect. I think I got it, there we go. Okay, we'll pass by the cover and wait till the end here of the talk, huh? Okay, in my memoir, a friend, former student at the New York Times, who's a graphic designer, helped me design a map that was a double-page spread that showed kind of the places that I talk about and photograph in this journey of 45 years. And one afternoon, after I turned in the manuscript and we were working on the layout and design, while the director of Indiana University Press wrote me an email, he said, "I need your dedication by tomorrow morning." And for most authors, I guess the idea of a dedication would be something that it was daunting, and it was the easiest thing I'd ever written. I dedicated this book to all of my colleagues and friends who have been killed in the line of duty. At National Geographic, there were a half dozen friends. In recent years, any number of people. Anya Niederinghaus is mentioned. I can see her name there. David Gilkey of National Public Radio. And then a final salute to photojournalists, men and women who've lost their lives in personal freedom in taking that unblinking look at conflicts in Syria and Iraq, Sudan, Somalia, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. And I consulted the Committee to Protect Journalists sort of list of the bad guy countries. And the picture is a combat boot at Khe Sanh Combat Base, where the demilitarized zone once separated North and South Vietnam. My wife and I were walking along the old runway in 1993, some 20 years after the end of the formal fighting in Vietnam, or but at least the American involvement, and here was an old combat boot. Now, I picked the pictures from Asia to show you, broadly defined, and I started the chapter on Asia saying, first I was a soldier, then a photojournalist, and finally a professor, but my heart has always been in Asia. And I tell students to be careful what happens to you in your 20s. Those first post-collegiate experiences can shape your life. They can hook you. And certainly going to Vietnam, Ha Long Bay here in the Gulf of Tonkin, going to Vietnam, going to Southeast Asia shaped my life forever. And my friend Joe Breen here in the audience, he and I were in the small town of Hoi An along the South China Sea and just met this Vietnamese lady who remembered the French times and the Americans and their South Vietnamese allies, and now the hordes and hordes and hordes of tourists who visit the town of Hoi An. She had seen it all and still had a smile and was part of that human experience. Going back to Vietnam, you know, for many of us who served there in the military, has been a wonderful personal journey. And I've been to Vietnam now 24, 25 times to work and to teach. And this is up in Dalat in the Central Highlands. And for me, that is Vietnam today, a country that is quite welcoming of we Americans, and it's opened itself to trade and tourism. Elsewhere in Southeast Asia, you know, Ta Prohm in Cambodia has been left as it was found by archaeologists, with the fig trees and the cotton and silk trees that suck moisture out of the masonry, but again, you know, overwhelmed by tourists. And I've looked at Buddhism in the region, including in Myanmar, where we've had the pillage against the Rohingya. In Saigon, the Zwaloi Pagoda is actually famous for a picture, not so much for the pagoda, but for a picture. This is the pagoda, the Zwaloi Pagoda, from which a procession of Buddhist monks started a procession into a neighboring intersection, and one monk in 1963 set himself on fire. The immolation was captured by Malcolm Brown of the Associated Press in Vietnam, was changed forever with that image. And another sect, of course, the Cao Dai in Vietnam, a syncretic sect that combines Taoism and Buddhism and Christianity and so forth. The Buddhist monks in Vietnam, and further to the south, in Indonesia, this fact in Bali, the Hindu influence and celebration. And you know, for me as a photographer traveling in Southeast Asia, it's those lime green rice fields, whether you're in Bali or in northern Vietnam near the China border. And people sometimes stop and ask me, how did you get that picture? We actually have a big print of this hanging in our bedroom. Actually, my wife had to use the restroom, and so we were just stopped, and this woman with a kid walked by. Rice production, you know, you can, I talk to students a lot about intimacy in our photographs. It's one thing to stand on a dike watching farmers transplant rice seedlings. It's another thing to get out there, I think, and show your audience how hard and how backbreaking this work is. And then looking at, for caption information on rice production in Thailand, the Thais are actually planting less of the high quality jasmine rice this year, planting more of other grades of rice to maintain their standing as the world's largest rice exporter. Certainly the Mekong Delta has always been the breadbasket of Asia, but problems on the Mekong, both of lowering of the water table, some 12 dams on the Mekong further upstream, has really upended production not only of rice, but various fruits, vegetables, fish farming, and so forth on the Mekong. And you know, sometimes we photographers, you know, you are just there when a moment happens. I had a flat tire down in the Mekong River, Mekong Delta, and was just waiting while the driver changed the tire. And here comes a bride and groom by on the motorbike on their way to their wedding. It's nothing you could have ever planned, but it made a nice situation. Well, you know, those power relationships, there's a good example of the unequal power relationships we have in Vietnam, or in photojournalism. But when this lady covered her eyes, I just thought, boy, she revealed so much about herself that I think that we learn a lot about her. The Lake of the Restored Sword in Hanoi, I think, is one of the prettiest spots in Vietnam and further down the Vietnamese coast, the fishing nets at, forget the name of the city, the presidential palace in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. And I included this picture because it's the last picture I took in August 9th, 1974, before I got wounded by a Khmer Rouge rocket round as American food was being distributed. And some very good people from the U.S. Embassy and non-governmental organizations got me out of Cambodia, got me to Thailand, and got me stitched up. But this is the last picture I had. I remember the U.S. Air Force nurse in the recovery room. It was the day that Richard Nixon resigned the presidency in disgrace. And I remember that U.S. Air Force nurse gave me the phone and said that I could call the States. And so I called my parents in Wisconsin. My mother was crying. It was about noon in Wisconsin. My mother was crying, and I said, "Mom, I'm going to be okay." You know, she said, "Oh, I know you're going to be okay." She said, "I'm crying for poor Mr. Nixon." So, so much for that. One of the last battles of the Vietnam War, as far as I'm concerned, is the battle for the genes of the Vietnamese people, the Agent Orange, that has caused Vietnam to be a country with per capita probably the largest, the highest number of birth defects per capita of any country in the world. And the Agent Orange, the dioxin in the environment, has now seeped into the genes of the Vietnamese people, so that we have these birth defects. In one of them is hydrocephalus, swelling of the skull. We have these birth defects now in 2 generations of Vietnamese children. Finally, there is some movement forward to decontaminate parts of Vietnam, but it is still a problem. And while in the United States we focus on Agent Orange as a long-term problem for veterans like myself, very few of us have looked at the Vietnamese, I think, and the soldiers who were on the other side. And I've had the privilege to meet some of our fellow warriors. Some years ago at National Geographic, I had to do a story about the opium poppy, the plant for good and evil. That was the headline, as I remember. And to find opium smoking in what was the Golden Triangle, Laos, Burma, and Thailand coming together, it was not a big deal. It was certainly a terrible headache after making this picture. The Golden Triangle has, of course, been eclipsed by the Golden Crescent in Afghanistan, Pakistan, as the primary opium poppy producing area. But you saw the Thai Rangers confiscating this stuff and so forth, and spent time with the tribal people in the Golden Triangle before that area became overwhelmed by tourists. And in Hanoi, the wonderful, on the eve of the Lunar New Year, the markets for the plum blossom and pear blossom, and I'll sort of end with Angkor. Moving on to Papua New Guinea, it was a 3-day boat ride across the center of New Guinea to get to what I recall was a crocodile farm, but a very pretty cloud formation, and on the Southeast Asia coastline into Indonesia, and the capital of Kuala Lumpur. And I did a book about the Muslim world of Southeast Asia that was oddly published right after 9/11. And I remember being in Malaysia and Indonesia before 9/11 and really being quite impressed with the Islamization of those countries and elsewhere. And I remember Seth Midens of the New York Times out in Bangkok sent me an email. He said, "Steve, you may be on to something with that Islam thing." And this was on the eve of 9/11. And I felt, am I on to something, or am I crazy here? But ultimately the book was published. And going on perhaps to India, a grain hoarder in the Punjab region of India. And in 1974, I had to go to Bangladesh, which is a newly formed nation at the time, to photograph a famine. It was part of a larger coverage on the global hunger crisis. And, I talk to students a lot about empathy. We photojournalists have to be able to put ourselves in the shoes of others if we're going to be effective. Now, I won't say that being empathetic is any easier for me than it is for any of the rest of us, but I saw this little girl in a line of thousands of people, and her loneliness and her bewilderment certainly kind of overpowered me, and trying to imagine what was going through her mind. And most photographers would probably have gone for a wide shot in a case like that to speak in television terms, but for me it was this little girl who made the cover, and the mother with the tears in her eyes and her children, and this was the rail station at Dhaka. It's the people from the countryside coming in. And, you know, Jody mentioned that I did a book a couple of years ago for Oxford University Press on Calcutta. And again, I have 6 or 7 colleagues who hail from Calcutta, but I never visited the city. And I was curious. And I think that's what we all share as journalists in common, is curiosity. To get this kind of overview of the city, my friend Joe and I tapped on the doors of maybe 24 Muslim families in this region of Zakaria Street, saying, hello, we're Americans, and we're wondering if we could traipse through your apartment and look at the view down the street from your balcony. And you can, I was overwhelmed by the kindness of Muslim families in this neighborhood, and eventually we found one. The rickshaw drivers, sort of iconic of the city of Calcutta, and the jute mills built by the Scots, and Mother Teresa's the hospice for the dying and the destitute, and the flower markets in Calcutta. And you can see why Tesco and Walmart and others are being resisted throughout India, because this is the system of distribution of products, not the efficient logistical supply chain that those companies had. During the the festival, I saw this little kid on the street, and I thought, my God, she does look like the goddess Kali, you know, incarnated. And, you know, today in India we find a thriving print media. Probably nowhere else in the world are you going to find newspapers and the print media growing at 12% a year. But you can see the variety of languages there. And the Ganges River in the morning, and go as quickly as possible. Chinese community, I wondered what had happened to the Chinese in Calcutta. Calcutta once was known for Chinese food, and they have been unable to get citizenship from the Indian government after independence from Great Britain, while the Chinese have largely migrated to Canada and Australia and New Zealand and so forth, but an old Chinese temple. And the Muslim, you know, India is the second largest Muslim country in the world, with 15% of its population are Muslim, about 173 million people after Indonesia, and on to Afghanistan, the Chicken Street Bazaar, and to Yemen, the first Arab country I ever had to report on, and not because I'm a specialist, but because my name was up, and on to Bahrain and the Persian Gulf, and to Dubai, where I was a visiting professor for a semester, and the sheikhs who are heavily guarded and so forth. And when I was in Yemen, the American embassy told me that there are no rental cars to be had. You better bring at least $10,000 US to buy something, and you should be able to resell it without losing any money. So I asked National Geographic for an extra $10,000 of expense money, and these are actually Yemeni money changers counting my money, which took them all day. But we bought the car, or the Toyota Land Cruiser, and a Yemeni shepherd with his Jambia dagger, which is an ever-present accoutrement of Yemeni men, and out at Marib, the moon god temple of the Queen of Sheba. This is a very dangerous area of Yemen today. And in Malaysia, the International Islamic Center, and in Abu Dhabi, in the UAE, where I taught last year. It's interesting, the Crown Prince took the Sheikh Zayed Mosque, which is one of the largest mosques in the world, can accommodate 80,000 people, and he renamed it the Mosque of Jesus and Mary in a bid to be more ecumenical, for what it's worth. Okay, well, I'll finish up with Russia. After a fellowship at Stanford University, in which Condoleezza Rice was my faculty advisor, we were assigned to Moscow for 5 years, and during the Gorbachev times, and the idea was to kick the door open as far as we could. Well, one place was, what does KGB headquarters look like? Nobody, I guess, I got out there on the street on a Soviet holiday, and that is the Lubyanka prison, the infamous Lubyanka prison behind Mr. Lenin's base. And you know, we were there at the end of the Cold War, but it was very much a Cold War. And A U.S. military attaché told me one day that the Afghan war veterans were going to be having a reunion in Gorky Park. He said, you ought to go over there. You're a Vietnam veteran. And I asked my Russian-speaking wife, I said, well, what do I say to these guys? And she said, well, just tell them you're a Vietnam veteran. And they call themselves the Afghansi. So I walked up and I said, yeah, Vietnamski. And they knew exactly what I meant. And they're very much the outcasts, as American Vietnam veterans were for some years, and the generals who sent them to Afghanistan. One of the, I think, most fortunate things about those 5 years in Russia was to see, as a journalistic story, to see the Russians sort of reach out to learn more about their own culture and history, and to sort of reclaim their faith, whatever that faith may be. The monks at a Russian Orthodox monastery, for example, suddenly they were available to us as journalists. It was not closed. Suddenly, tens of thousands of young people wanted to be married in a church, and it's not that these young people know one another, it's just there were so many of them on Saturday morning who wanted to get married, they're just ganged up a dozen or more at a time. Oops. What did we lose? Did we lose? Oh, there we go. Fine. We just, okay. And you know, so to see the religion as a story, suddenly Jews felt that they could worship freely and in the open, or at least more freely. And you know, I could look, I did a book about St. Petersburg and look at the beautiful spaces in this city of the czars. I swear that those young people on the Winter Canal have to be in the ballet, and see some of Catherine the Great's riches. And I was just wandering around the Kirov Ballet between acts and stumbled upon this, and I think there's a lesson there, and we're going to finish in 2 seconds, that sometimes it's not the moment that we need as photojournalists, you know, the telling moment where someone is arrested or shot or something. It's the moment between the moment that gives us the feeling of everyday life and that brings us in touch with one another. And finally, you know, the first day of school. The flowers are for the teacher. And I'll go, you know, if you're an older person like myself, why, you can identify with that picture. And so I'll finish here in the tundra of Siberia. I had to do an article once on all of Siberia. And 500 miles above the Arctic Circle, why a supply helicopter was bringing supplies to the Ninsi, nomadic reindeer herders. And while my wife was in the teepee translating for the National Geographic writer who spoke no Russian, why, I was standing around outside freezing to death, and this little boy came up, very curious, and we made eye contact. And so frequently across cultures, it's that eye contact and that willingness and that openness that I think makes a picture. So what kind of questions do you have? Do we have time?
Time for a few questions. And when you're asking a question, if you could identify yourself and your organization, that would be great.
This is the easy part.
So who wants to start with a question? We'll come bring you microphones. Well, Chris, we'll start with the question. We can always get a question out of Chris.
Chris Slaughter from the NCC. You've already kind of said.
Favorite Asian picture? Oh boy, Chris. I probably don't have one, you know. You know, the picture of the opium smoker encircled, I didn't even know I took that picture, or I don't remember it. I sort of remember the headache. I remember the headache as I came out of that house. I'll never forget the headache. But as I was going through the National Geographic archive online looking for photographs with my name on them, why, that popped up. And you know, once I made a print of it, and there's a print downstairs in the exhibit, I actually thought, you know, I'm really happy with this, and it was never published. And I remember the headache. So if I probably had to pick that, it might be the opium smoker, or perhaps one of the blue pictures from the Gulf of Tonkin. And it was, my wife Barbara and I were very lucky to go back to Vietnam for the first time in 1993, before the wave of tourism, and be some of the first Americans to get to go here, there, and everywhere, where there was no diplomatic relationship with our two countries, no nothing. When I was photographing for National Geographic, I'll tell a story out of school, in Vietnam, because of the trade embargo, I would send my film to Mark Pinkston at the Hong Kong Government Information Office, and Mark would box it up and send it to National Geographic for me, because there was no way to send a parcel out of Vietnam. So, look, my cane. Other questions? Yes, sir.
I enjoyed your talk very much. My name is John Antweiler. I'm an American, but retired here in Hong Kong, so I guess I share your love of Asia.
Look at you.
My question is, as a photojournalist, you took thousands, maybe millions of photographs, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the editing process that the editors of the magazine used on your photos.
That's a good question, John. I think in general, as we look at journalism, and I don't know how many of you are in print journalism, but as we look at print journalism around the world, the editing process has really fallen by the wayside. We have far fewer picture editors at newspapers and magazines, websites, and so forth than we once did. A typical day for a newspaper photographer, certainly in the United States, would be to check in by telephone or email with the desk and head off to an assignment, stop at a Starbucks and image your pictures and send them by email to the office. And I know photographers at the New York Times and the Washington Post who don't go into the office from 1 week to the next. They are their own editors. That's why I bring this up. There's been a dramatic reduction in the number of people who call themselves picture editors at both magazines and newspapers. National Geographic may be one of the exceptions that still has editors, but as a group, it's very much an endangered species. Now, when you're working with editors, it was really quite easy in the days of Kodachrome or color slides, color transparencies, little bitty things that reflected light. Today, with digital files, it is a much more arduous process to go through, as you know, all of these pictures that you take to find something that's really decent to be considered for use or publication or one thing or another. And is there a secret to editing? Just about the time I might think there is a formula, you're going to, I think the big temptation is always, whether in any editing process of pictures, is you're looking for something specific, a picture that you remember that you took that tells the story, and you pass over 3 or 4 great pictures just because it wasn't why you were there, it wasn't what you were after. Like the opium smoker. I was there thinking about something else. So I would say that in the digital environment, certainly editing photographs is more difficult. Archiving things is more difficult. We now have to worry about storing things off-site in case your house burns down or your office burns down. And how do you access all these files years from now? I don't think much of this is, frankly, John, is figured out yet as formats keep changing and so forth. So I yearn for the days of film for that reason. That's not a good answer, I know. Other questions? Please, yes, sir.
Hi, thanks very much. My name's Bill Agee. I'm an associate member here. I'm just wondering what got you interested in photography in the first place and what your first camera was.
Oh, Bill, that's a good, easy question. What got me interested in photography? I had a model. My father was a newspaper editor, and I had a model railroad, and he brought home a Rolleiflex twin lens reflex camera from the newspaper and said, well, let's take some pictures of the model railroad you and your brother have constructed in the base and send them to a model railroad magazine, which we did, and they got published. This was when I was perhaps 13 or 14 years old. And it was an easy step to say, to hell with railroads. I'm really much more interested in photography. And the high school I went to had a good high school newspaper. So it was a process of sort of falling into something that you were interested in. I will say, though, it was hard to become a photojournalist. In the 60s, certainly when I was an undergraduate, in the 70s when I was a graduate student, no one in the United States particularly thought a photographer or photojournalist needed a university education. People kept trying to push me into writing until one day I just said, to hell with it, I'm going to be a photojournalist. So that was a problem. And when I was in the Army, officers were not supposed to carry cameras. That was for sergeants and others, was to be a photographer. And I kept getting yelled at by colonels when I'd have a camera with me. So seriously, so it was sort of, I won't say it was hard fought, but to professionally to finally decide to be a photojournalist was kind of a leap of faith. And then to be, I have a scene in my book where I'm invited to National Geographic in the spring of 1972, and I'm sitting in front of the director of photography, who was a gruff guy, at least his exterior was, and he was, well known throughout the world. And I said, well, why am I here, Mr. Gilka? I have never taken a color picture for publication. And if you would forgive the language, but it's important. And he stared across his glasses and he said, we can make the picture any goddamn color we want. But then he went on to say, I'm hiring you for the way you think and the way you see the world. And I have passed that on, that sentence, to thousands and thousands of students. That I still think that people who hire young people in whatever form of journalism are still looking for young people who think in an original way and see the world in an original way. And the rest of it you can learn. So I was lucky that somebody saw something in a kid who literally had never taken a color photograph. Okay?
We have time for one more question, if there's another question. Over here.
This young man, yes.
Hi, I'm Kai Clark, a student at the Australian National University. I just have a question that, as a photojournalist, what responsibilities do photojournalists have to question their pre-existing conceptions of a place? So, for example, I think with photos of Southeast Asia, the ones you presented were quite beautiful. A lot of them are very much liked. There's also some that are stereotypical pictures of Buddhism, of temples, of paddy fields. And I realize in that context of when they're taken, that's fine, but very much now, that's a very stereotypical image that may not be actually representative of the country itself. So I think, providing that context, going back to the question, so what responsibility do you feel that photojournalists have now to try and accurately represent a region and not rely on these preconceived notions? Sorry, a bit complicated question.
Well, no, it's not too complicated. I think you're always trying to understand what you're seeing, and it's crazy to go to any assignment, whether you're a writer or photographer, and without doing your homework, without doing your research, and trying to understand, why am I here and what is it I'm trying to show or trying to say. So I think the research aspect of our work is vital to understanding our subject. Certainly, the deeper you get into a subject, the more people you meet, the more people you talk to, one thing leads to another, and then you can start to find something that is more original. But I think, you're looking for an original take on something, and that, as I understand, most editors are. And even if you're working for people who expect a stereotypical image, that doesn't say you have to stop at that point. Well, we have problems and pressures of deadlines. But our responsibility, I think our responsibility is always to question, why am I here? And what am I trying to say? Part of the creative process is to step back and think about, what is it you're trying to say? And what are the ways, the most effective ways to do that? And it might mean tearing up what you've written. It might mean saying, I haven't got anything, and I'm going to start something in a different way. Now, you think some of my images are stereotypical. We've all got cultural, cultural gaps or come from different cultures. I see Vietnam probably certainly different from you. I see Vietnam today as a peaceful and beautiful country that in the middle of the night, it is not that, it's a very different country in the middle of the night for some of us to think about what Vietnam was like. It was a nightmare, and for many people it remains a nightmare. So to see some part of Vietnam that is just drop dead gorgeous, I'm going to sort of work to capture that as well. And so we all come at things, from a different culture, a different perspective, and a different sense of history. And I think it's important, when we assign photographers to pick, picking the right person for the job is critical. Okay? Thank you, huh?
Well, thank you all. Little gift from the FCC. Here, we have the bag.